Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, International Financial Institutions will come to order. Without objection, Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Welcome to our humble and confining room today. Sorry about this, but we've got multiple hearings going on. We do the short straw. But anyway, this hearing is entitled Oversight of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, FTI. Without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. With that, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Undersecretary Nelson, Director Doss, thank you both for being here today. Proper oversight of administrative agencies by Congress is an important responsibility we exercise to ensure those very agencies are fulfilling their statutory responsibilities and adhering to congressional intent. For far too long, FinCEN has operated under the radar, quietly amassing new authorities, and frankly, that would shock the American citizen. The amount of information FinCEN has access to likely makes our intelligence community very jealous. It is imperative that Congress pulls back the curtain on these authorities and the ways in which FinCEN uses them. Along with a seemingly ever-expanding list of authorities, it has become clear that the burden on investment for the immense regulatory burdens FinCEN places on financial institutions is lacking. In February, I sent a letter to Attorney General Garland about Section 6201 of the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. This letter was my response to a jaw-dropping report that outlined the Department of Justice failures to track statistics on how it uses BSA reports despite statutory mandates. The DOJ's disregard for the section of AMLA 2020 and inability to state the usefulness of the data begs the question if the burdensome reporting is worthwhile. Without objection, I request unanimous consent to submit a copy of this letter into the record, which we have right here. Neither our witnesses today, without objection, by the way, neither our witnesses today control how the DOJ uses BSA data. I know that, but this is DOJ's issue, and it's emblematic of the larger problem before us today. FinCEN and the Treasury Department have shown to be unable to properly balance national security with limiting burdens on those they regulate. Let's take, for example, the ongoing beneficial ownership rulemaking. Earlier this month, I joined a letter led by Chair McHenry and Senator Whitehouse on your most recent notice and request for comment on the BO form that small businesses will have to fill out. We had 6 members of the House and 6 members of the Senate, including chairs and ranking members, join a letter to push back on what should have been a straightforward notice. This FinCEN notice was so off base that Congress had to put forward a bicameral and bipartisan response to tell you that enough is enough. During a time in American politics where Republicans and Democrats can rarely agree, we all were able to rally around the fact that FinCEN is not getting it right. I hope you read our message loud and clear. The Corporate Transparency Act was created to be a strategic tool to target bad actors abusing our financial system while simultaneously reducing the regulatory burden on both small businesses and regulated entities. FinCEN's proposed beneficial ownership form fails to reduce the burden for financial institutions by forcing it to collect information that the law clearly states FinCEN should be collecting. Moving to sanctions, we need to demand accountability from Treasury for its refusal to stop Russia from waging war on Ukraine. As the Institute of International Finance has shown, Russian imports are stable from a year ago, with Chinese exports making up for Western goods. The Treasury has allowed sanctioned Russian banks to use the U.S. financial system in order to rake in energy-related revenues, and it worked to roll back tough EU sanctions on Russian crude. Treasury appears to care more about the oil market and Democrats' electoral prospects than Putin's war crimes. This is shameful. In China, the CCP continues to perpetuate genocide against the Uyghurs. While Treasury has sanctioned a number of foreign leaders around the world, top officials in the Chinese Politburo have been spared. There is no excuse for this inaction. History will not judge this administration kindly if Undersecretary Nelson and his colleagues refuse to punish Beijing for its atrocities. With that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Pedersen, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm sitting in this seat today as vice ranking member of the committee because ranking member Beatty is unavailable. And I would like to enter her opening statement for the record.
Yes.
I can just keep going.
Yes.
I'm still learning here. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate you. And thank you for the critical work that you're doing to protect our country from domestic and international terrorism and stop criminals who specialize in drug, human, and firearm trafficking from utilizing the American financial system to exploit people throughout our communities. One area of your focus that is a top priority for me is working together to stop the flood of fentanyl into this country. Like too many Americans, my family has been impacted by the opioid crisis. My mom's addiction began with the overprescription of opioids, which led to heroin and ultimately fentanyl, when it started to take over the drug supply chain in 2016. Unfortunately, my mom's story is not unique in Jefferson County or in Colorado or the United States. The opioid epidemic is now more lethal than ever as we continue to see drugs become more and more potent and easier to traffic. We have seen the devastating impacts of overdoses and fentanyl poisoning across this country and around the world. Addressing this crisis with the urgency and dedication needed to save lives and protect our kids is going to require significant resources for agencies like yours to stop the drug cartels from utilizing our financial system to launder money, support better coordination between agencies, as well as stopping the widespread distribution and sale of illicit drugs through social media platforms and payment apps. The agencies you represent play an essential role in all of this. The Office of TFI and FinCEN are not solely working in prevention. Instead, your agencies specialize in identifying criminal activities and then using the intelligence to detect and disrupt their activities. As a mom of a 3-year-old, I want to thank you for what you and your team are doing to protect our country and look forward to discussing your essential work in more depth, including the updates on the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 and the Corporate Transparency Act of 2020, which, after fully being implemented, will likely represent one of the most significant efforts in decades to combat the financing of terrorism and other criminal activity that threaten the United States. I am deeply concerned with the budget reductions that were just passed out of the House yesterday and what this means for our national security and the future of our country. The Office of TFI and its sub-agencies like FinCEN and the Office of Foreign Asset Control are already understaffed. If the cuts implemented by the House budget were to go into effect that just passed, the capacity and capability of these agencies to effectively do their jobs will be seriously curtailed. We will see significant staff cuts and potentially programmatic cuts. I know that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle also care deeply about these issues, and we must forcefully speak up against these budget cuts that will make our country less safe and hinder the important work that agencies like yours are undertaking every day. I now yield my time back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. With that, today we welcome the testimony of Mr. Brian Nelson, Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, U.S. Department of Treasury. Prior to joining Treasury, Mr. Nelson was the Chief Legal Officer at LA 28, the organizing committee for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. His previous government service includes roles as a Senior Policy Advisor, Policy Chief, and General Counsel in the California Department of Justice. Mr. Hamdas, Acting Director, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Prior to his role as Acting Director of FinCEN, Mr. Das was most recently Chief Legal Officer with compliance consultancy K2 Integrity, as well as an advisor with CM International, the Global Government Relations and Public Policy Affiliate of Crowell and Mooring LLP. His prior roles at the Treasury included General Counsel, Assistant General Counsel for International Affairs, and Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade and Investment. We thank each of you for taking time to be here today. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give oral testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Just as a highlight, please do speak into your microphone. We have some folks on the back lines that are our staff folks that sometimes can't hear. We can hear you from this side, but they can't hear you from that side, so it's important that you do use the microphone and speak into it. So with that, Secretary Nelson, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, Chairman Luke Meyer, Vice Ranking Member Pedersen, Chairman McHenry, who joined us earlier, as well as the distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about the Treasury Department's efforts and achievements on AML CFT and the critical work that the Treasury's Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Office does to safeguard the U.S. and international financial systems. In the past few years, the demand for TFI's expertise has grown exponentially. In the past year alone, the department has played a central role on a range of national security priorities, including in the response to Russia's further invasion of Ukraine. Simultaneously, we understand that illicit actors have taken advantage of gaps within the U.S. and international financial systems. One of TFI's core missions is to close these exploitable gaps. We do this in a number of ways, including by promulgating regulations for a comprehensive and risk-based AML-CFT framework, identifying typologies of illicit finance, collecting, analyzing, and sharing information, strengthening international AML-CFT standards, taking enforcement actions, and engaging the private sector and non-governmental organizations. This approach gives TFI flexibility in responding to systemic threats to the domestic and international financial systems. It also enables us to balance national security and economic considerations while mitigating the unintended consequences of our authorities, including sanctions. Sanctions continue to be a very effective tool of U.S. foreign policy. In response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, our efforts include issuing 4 executive orders, over 80 new or amended general licenses, over 200 frequently asked questions, and more than 2,300 new or amended designations. Working with allies, we have immobilized Russia's central bank reserves held in partner countries and sanctioned and de-SWIFted some of Russia's largest banks. Our sanctions have degraded Russia's ability to replace over 10,000 tanks and pieces of equipment lost since the start of this war, forced production shutdowns at key defense facilities, and caused shortages of essential components for tanks and aircraft. Russia is also running out of munitions, and they're turning to Soviet-era weapons. Meanwhile, with your support, we and our allies and partners have provided Ukraine with state-of-the-art military equipment. Our work, of course, continues, and we are focusing on disrupting Russia's efforts to evade our sanctions. As the largest economy in the world, the U.S. must close the gaps in our own domestic AML-CFT regime while increasing transparency and accountability globally. The latest AML-CFT tools are available because of the bipartisan Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. Implementing the AMLA and the Corporate Transparency Act is my top priority. For example, starting on January 1, 2024, many companies formed or operating in the United States will need to begin to report information about their beneficial owners to FinCEN. This is a key step to making our financial system harder for illicit actors to exploit. We are developing guidance materials and a helpline to assist small businesses and help minimize reporting burdens while ensuring the information remains valuable for law enforcement. Beyond our regulatory agenda, we must continue to address the de-risking of financial institutions that can disproportionately affect the humanitarian community, small nation states, and underserved populations. This work is critical to maintaining the strength of the U.S. financial system. On April 25th, the Treasury Department released its first ever de-risking strategy, which identifies key customer categories often impacted by de-risking, top causal factors behind de-risking, and policy options for combating it. Through all of this work, our partnership with the private sector and civil society is truly paramount. I am focused on further bolstering this needed dialogue. We also are continuing to lead the world in mitigating the illicit finance risks of emerging technologies and other evolving threats, including the use of digital assets. TFI has published multiple risk assessments on the topic of digital assets, including releasing this month a decentralized finance risk assessment, the first by any country in the world. So I'll just conclude, but want to stress that this work has only been possible because of the dedicated men and women of TFI, and I'm deeply grateful to work side by side with them every day, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Undersecretary Nelson. Director Doss, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Lukemeyer, Vice Ranking Member Pedersen, and Chairman McHenry. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee. First, I'd like to thank both the subcommittee and the full committee for your support for FinCEN's work. As you know, our mission is to promote national security and protect the American public by working with our partners and stakeholders, law enforcement and national security agencies, financial regulators and financial institutions, to prevent financial crimes from undermining the integrity of the U.S. financial system. And I'd like to thank those same partners for their collaboration in ensuring an effective AML-CFT framework, one that protects the American public while at the same time works to minimize burdens for the American taxpayer and small businesses. I'd also like to take a moment to express my heartfelt appreciation to the FinCEN team. They continue to make Herculean efforts and deliver amazing results despite significant headwinds. I'm pleased to report that FinCEN is working hard to meet our many new and long-standing mandates, and I'd like to highlight a few of our efforts over the past year. First of all, as Undersecretary Nelson mentioned, implementation of the Beneficial Ownership Information Framework continues to be a top priority. We have dedicated significant resources and all of our recent annual funding increases to this effort because enhancing corporate transparency and exposing anonymous shell companies will have real benefits. Criminals too often take advantage of opaque shell companies in ways that hurt American taxpayers. In fact, just 10 days before we issued the final reporting rule on beneficial ownership information, DOJ announced federal criminal charges against 47 defendants for their alleged roles in a $250 million fraud scheme that exploited a federally funded child nutrition program during the COVID-19 pandemic. Among other things, the defendants created dozens of shell companies to receive and launder the proceeds of their fraudulent schemes. And opaque shell companies are being abused by foreign actors and drug trafficking organizations to undermine national security. For example, opaque shell companies were used to facilitate sanctions evasion by a Chinese national who used U.S. businesses to facilitate the supply of military and metallurgical items to Iran. In the future, the Beneficial Ownership Information Database will help to provide enforcement with efficient access to the beneficial ownership information that it needs to investigate and indict criminals who hide behind shell companies. And increased transparency can help honest U.S. businesses that are both being defrauded and are being put at a disadvantage when competing against criminals who exploit vulnerabilities in our system to evade taxes and hide their illicit wealth. That is why we're working hard to get 3 things done before the new rules go into effect. First, we're carefully reviewing public comments so that we can finalize the regulatory framework and the forms needed to report beneficial ownership information. Second, we are designing and building the IT framework so that we can ensure a secure and confidential database. And third, and most importantly, we are reaching out to stakeholders, small business groups, and state agencies, and at the same time working on guidance so that we can ensure that small businesses, many of whom may never have heard of FinCEN, understand their obligations, and so that reporting beneficial ownership is as streamlined and as straightforward as possible. We also continue to work hard to ensure that the U.S. has an effective and risk-based AML-CFT framework. The Anti-Money Laundering Act, or the AML Act, provides a clear roadmap to achieve these objectives, to enhance feedback loops, to allow financial institutions to focus on high-value reporting and higher risks, to provide examiner training and focus on risk-based supervision, and to modernize the AML-CFT framework. We recognize that we have a lot of work to do, and that these efforts will require sustained engagement over time, close collaboration with all stakeholders, and a fully staffed FinCEN team. In closing, I'd like to stress 2 important points. First, the reporting that FinCEN receives from financial institutions is invaluable to policymakers, to OFAC, and to law enforcement and national security agencies. To stop the Russian government from misusing the global financial system to fund Russia's war efforts, and to track fraudsters who prey on Americans and small businesses. Simply speaking, America is safer because of it. And second, trust and confidence in how we manage and secure this information is fundamental. That's why we're working closely with the Office of the Inspector General to address their concerns on an expedited basis. I'd like to close by reaffirming that FinCEN is dedicated to the mission of protecting U.S. national security and the integrity of the U.S. and global financial systems, and we look forward to continuing the collaborative relationship with all of you, and thank you again and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Did very well. Both stayed at the 5-minute mark. Appreciate your respective time. I'll recognize myself now for 5 minutes, opening remarks and questions here. In my opening statement, I mentioned that DOJ's failure to track BSA statistics. I was referencing an August 2022 GAO report entitled Bank Secrecy Act, Action Needed to Improve DOJ Statistics on Use of Reports on Suspicious Financial Transactions. Acting Director Doss, are you familiar with that report and my letter about the lack of findings?
Yes, I am, sir.
Okay, within that report, GAO highlighted that only 2 agencies, the IRS-CI and the United States Secret Service, as having the ability to collect data on their use of BSA reports. Has FinCEN worked with either of those agencies to connect them with all the other law enforcement partners that have failed to track and report this data to DOJ?
Yes, sir. We have worked with IRS-CI, we've worked with the U.S. Secret Service, and we've worked with other law enforcement agencies to have a conversation around how to better improve their tracking of statistics around the use of BSA reporting, and we'll continue to engage with them on this effort to be able to improve those statistics. In fact, we recently published a FinCEN 2022 year in review that included a number of statistics where we engage with law enforcement to better track some of this information, and we continue to work to improve that tracking of information. This will be a continuing effort, and I'm committed to doing it.
Secretary Nelson, can you describe how you've encouraged the DOJ to improve statistics on their use of the BSA report?
So we have consistently heard from law enforcement partners about the usefulness of SAR reporting, and of course, as him noted, we are making efforts to track their use of the reports more closely. I would just step back and note that FinCEN has really, I think, done an admirable job of playing the broker between financial institutions and law enforcement to ensure that the BSA reporting that law enforcement is receiving is very valuable, connecting financial institutions directly to law enforcement, and continuing to make sure that there's a effective feedback loop between both law enforcement and financial institutions.
If I have time, I want to come back to this issue, but I've got a couple of questions to make sure I want to get to here. First, Director Doss, you talked about the IG report, or working with the IG on some things. IG report's coming out shortly. We haven't got it yet, but I understand that there are 28 areas of concern in that report. Are you working with the IG to address all those issues?
Yes, sir. We are engaged in a constructive relationship with the Office of the Inspector General, and we are working with them constructively in terms of addressing the concerns that they've already raised to us with respect to the various dimensions of their reports. While we haven't seen the draft reports yet with respect to each of the 4 elements of the audit, we have already started aggressively working to implement to address their concerns. And in fact, we are making substantial progress on that front, and we're engaged with the Office of Inspector General on a regular basis to be responsive.
When we get our hands on the report, we're going to look at it very carefully, and we may either have another hearing or ask you to report in written form to some of the stuff that's in there. So we're going to continue to work with whatever they find. Undersecretary Nelson, you're kind of all things with regards to sanctions. I sit on the China Select Committee. We're concerned about China invading Taiwan. We've just had a very instrumental situation, a learning moment from the Russians invading Ukraine. We weren't ready with regards to sanctions. We did everything after the fact. So my question to you is the same I posed to Chairman Powell a few weeks ago. Knowing that this is going to happen, I don't think anybody would deny it's a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Have you at Treasury, you folks at Treasury, are starting to work on a program where you're starting to identify individuals, entities, countries that you're getting ready to sanction?
As you know, we don't preview our sanctions actions, but Secretary Yellen has been clear as recently as last week that we will use all tools in our toolbox in order to ensure that.
You don't tell me what the plan looks like. Are you putting together a plan? That's all you have to say.
So, like I said, appreciate the question. In the spirit of the question, we just don't preview the work that we're doing.
Okay, I assume you won't answer this question either, but I'm curious because what we did against Russia was get our allies to all get together and help us with the sanctions. Are you doing this now, talking with allies and getting more allies together so that we can have some friends when this all happens to be able to put something together very quickly?
So one of the conversations that we have engaged in quite significantly with allies and partners is supply chain resilience, diversifying supply chains, and friendshoring, as the Secretary has described it. So that's a conversation that is ongoing. I was just in Europe last week having those conversations with partners and allies.
Okay, thank you very much. My time's expired. With that, we recognize Ranking Member Ms. Pedersen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Undersecretary Nelson and Director Doss, for being with us. As I've mentioned, something that's very important to me is addressing the opioid epidemic. And I think that any American, any citizen that you talk to would support in general the work that you're doing, but they have probably a harder time tying back to the impact that your work is bringing for their community. And so when I think about the opioid epidemic specifically, all of us who are sitting up here today are losing countless lives every day needlessly because of fentanyl. And can you give a specific example of what your agencies, a real life example of what you've been able to do to disrupt drug cartels and the distribution of illicit drugs like fentanyl?
Thank you for that question. And as you can imagine, this is a top priority for me, for the Treasury Department. The very first trip I took as Undersecretary was to Mexico, and I was just recently at the border having exactly this conversation. We have at Treasury been focused on how can we disrupt the money laundering activity that really is the base of the flow of not only fentanyl to the United States, but also the precursors and the equipment that it takes to press the pills. And frankly, recently we've done a number of actions to go after both the transnational criminal organizations that are involved in the fentanyl production, but also really focus as recently as, I guess, 2 weeks ago, working across the whole of government with partners at DOJ, DEA, DHS to go after whole networks of individuals. So we designated, again, a number of the suppliers of the precursors from the Treasury designation. There were a number of indictments also revealed, but it was a multi-jurisdictional global effort to really try to get after the networks that are supporting this. And that's sort of the key, I think, value add that we bring at the Treasury Department, is we focus on those sort of financial networks that really undergird the shipment of these drugs. So that includes mapping the networks, trying to identify what they are, and then opportunities for disruption, which include the use of our sanctions.
Great, thank you. And as I've already mentioned, how important your work is to the security of the United States and the security of the people in our communities. I'm deeply concerned about the budget that was just passed yesterday and the impacts that it will have on your ability to continue to do your work and protect the United States. So can you talk about exactly what these cuts would mean for your agencies?
No, I really appreciate that question. As the Secretary noted just a few weeks ago, should we be faced with such a cut, TFI writ large, but really OFAC would be particularly challenged in the imposition of our sanctions authorities. As you all know, we have imposed sanctions to address really every issue at the forefront of national security. Their effectiveness and our ability to enforce them would be diminished significantly. Our ability to go after future bad actors would be compromised. And we are, as you can imagine, constantly investigating ways we can strengthen our sanctions, and that work would also suffer. We also, I think, would reflect that it would come at a particularly terrible time given all of the work that we are doing in support of Ukraine in the context of Russia's illegal invasion of that country and the signal it would send to partners and allies to receive that cut and going to the point of closing gaps within our own system, the ability to identify Russian money and assets here. So I'll stop there.
Only 30 seconds left. I wanted to discuss what additional authority you all could utilize to actually address the just mass distribution of illicit drugs through the social media platforms and other cash apps and other apps like that. So I will follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. Undersecretary Nelson, we will work with you on your budget, and a 1% increase every year is not a cut. Let me clarify. But we do need to prioritize funding for OFAC because you've got a lot of important work to do. I'm currently working on legislation that would block all U.S. investment in Chinese military and surveillance companies listed on Treasury's non-SDN Chinese Military Industrial Complex companies list, as well as DoD's Chinese military companies list and Commerce's entity list and military end user list. Can you describe the impact a U.S. investment ban would have on these companies' access to capital, and what impact would this have beyond the ban on publicly traded securities?
So I'm tracking your bill and appreciate the question and certainly the spirit behind it. I would note that's actually a different part of the Department of the Treasury. It's our Office of Investment Security that will do outbound investment. So I'm happy to take that back and work closely with them and provide technical assistance, obviously.
Thank
on
you.
your piece of legislation.
And I know the administration is working on an outbound investment screening effort as well. We want to work with Treasury on that.
We're happy to do that.
As Treasury promulgates the CMIC list, what sectors specifically should OFAC pay particular attention to in order to make sure U.S. investors are not unwittingly financing Chinese entities that threaten our national security?
So we have obviously at Treasury been particularly focused on those entities that have been involved in gross human rights abuse. We have been focused on entities that, as recently of a couple of weeks ago, we designated an entity that was providing satellite support for the Wagner Group. So we are deeply focused on getting after those entities within China and frankly anywhere in the world that are providing support that is going to be meaningful to Russia on the battlefield, and that has been our focus.
A quick, and also I would just, and my bill will get at this, but critical sectors, semiconductors, AI, dual-use technologies that could compromise our national security, military surveillance companies, we want those entities targeted. Can you describe China's sanctions evasions capabilities in light of its anti-foreign sanctions laws, its pursuit of a CBDC, the increase in de-dollarized cross-border trade, and also their attempt to create their own SWIFT system that would run counter to the West's SWIFT program?
Yeah, so obviously we were watching that very closely. We at Treasury just put out a report on the future of money and payments, which called for a Treasury-led interagency group, and my office is responsible for the national security implications of a CBDC here, and obviously we are developing that in the context of looking at the ECNY. Clearly, China has a really poor record of responsible behavior in cyberspace and has used technology to surveil and repress its population. So this is something that we think can be pose a heightened risk and create significant consumer protection risks as well as risks for illicit finance. So we are tracking it very closely and we are working on sort of policy options in the context of the working group.
Yeah, and as we look to a potential response and a multilateral sanctions response to a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan, we need to be very aware of China's sanctions evasions capabilities with this alternative to SWIFT. I think they're learning from what's happening in Ukraine. I would note also that not a single member of the Politburo Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party has been sanctioned by OFAC despite the global pandemic, the genocide against the Uyghurs, the spy balloon over key sensitive military sites, and the illegal police stations in our country. That is something I would ask Treasury to take a look at. Finally, on fentanyl, a follow-up to the good question from my colleague. How important is it that we target the Chinese government officials who allow for and support fentanyl trafficking and precursor production? I think we need to do a more vigorous effort to sanction entities that are ultimately responsible up the chain for fentanyl production and poisoning our people.
No, obviously, thank you for that perspective. We are working very closely with partners at DEA, DHS, and really across our government to try to identify those entities with China and globally that are critical nodes in the production and then the facilitation of fentanyl to the United States. So that is something that we will continue to focus on and welcome again sort of the partnership and thinking through what's the best way to get after those facilitators.
Thank you, Secretary. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member. And we really appreciate you being here, Mr. Secretary Nelson and Acting Director Doss. I have some questions that were in follow-up to a hearing that we had just recently in the same committee, which was called Follow the Money. It was a hearing related to the fentanyl crisis in this country, which I think is a top issue for me, and I think it's a top issue for many members of Congress. Representing a border district, we're regularly a backdrop in the news in this country, and how what we're trying to see is how we can be helpful in this committee to both of your organizations in creating policy that allows you to access more information, to track the money, and also work with our counterparts in Mexico. I'd like to ask what ideas that you would have that you would suggest to this committee that would be helpful that are not available now to you.
Thank you for that, and I would offer that we are certainly open to all additional suggestions. But let me, if I can, just step back and give you a sense of what our multi-pronged strategy has been. First, we work largely using FinCEN, in partnership with FinCEN, mapping the transnational criminal organizations' financial networks. And then we require financial institutions, again, using FinCEN's authorities, to report suspicious activity to generate leads for law enforcement. We work closely with the private sector, of course, and then we work to target sanctions to the extent we're able to identify and then cut off those transnational criminal organizations from their members and the enablers from the international financial system, because again, a lot of the precursors, Chinese money laundering organizations rely on the international financial system. We are looking to see if there are regulatory gaps that we need to close, and we are happy to come back to you on that.
I'd love to hear from you on that
and
issue.
then obviously working with international partners, because it's just not a U.S. problem, but it's one that touches everyone around the globe.
That's right. And in the same hearing, it was indicated that the administration in Mexico, the present administration under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has not been as helpful as previous administrations. And how would you assess the state of the relationship between Treasury and your Mexican counterparts with respect to our shared counter-narcotics priorities?
Yeah, I would assess that it's strong. So I visited right after I was confirmed with counterparts in Mexico City. I have joined the high-level security dialogue here in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago. I've been to the border to hear more from our partners on our side about ways we can work more closely with Mexico to get after this. And all of that, I think, work is starting to show up in the way we've gone after these organizations. In fact, just today, we designated a Jalisco network that was involved in timeshare fraud, which is a huge money generator for them. And, again, significantly being able to get at these networks that are doing a lot of things, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and the like, has been a sort of a critical strategy that using Treasury authorities, we've been able to support the overall governmental effort.
Thank you. And Director Doss, in terms of FinCEN dealing with their counterparts in Mexico, how's that going? And are y'all making some headway? Are you working together and finding and tracking how resources are being transferred, not only through apps, but obviously wire transfers, trade-based money laundering, and other sorts that way?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. We have a positive relationship with our counterpart financial intelligence unit, and a positive and constructive information sharing relationship with them. We share suspicious activity reporting involving opioids and fentanyl as well. We're working collaboratively with them on a number of different fronts in terms of cooperation with law enforcement and cooperation with the FIU. We recently participated in the North American Drug Dialogue with Canada and our Mexican counterparts to consider ways to collaborate and cooperate and share information more proactively. In the near term, we'll have a trilateral working group that will essentially be a workshop to enhance ways to share typologies, red flags associated with money laundering and fentanyl. And then we're also working on enhancing our memorandum of understanding and our collaborative relationship with
Thank you.
FIU.
I think I'm out of time, but I'll wave back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Everybody's done a great job of hitting the 5 minutes worth of speaking here and questions. We want to make sure we continue that. We probably have votes at 4 o'clock here, so we'll make sure we get to everybody. Should be able to do that if we all are respectful of each other's time. So with that, we recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, the chairman of the Small Business Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. FinCEN has identified combating human trafficking and smuggling as one of its top priorities. Reports have shown a concerning increase in online child sexual exploitation being monetized through the U.S. financial sector. FinCEN has the ability to enforce existing regulatory requirements through the Patriot Act to prevent the facilitation of online child exploitation and sex trafficking through the U.S. financial sector. However, I have not seen any steps taken by FinCEN to address the risk of monetizing these horrific crimes. So, Acting Director Doss, please elaborate to us on what actions FinCEN is taking in its oversight role of the financial services industry to prevent the monetization of child abuse and sex trafficking.
So thank you for that question. We take this issue incredibly seriously. It's a top priority of ours. We work very hard to combat online child sexual exploitation, and we're working with law enforcement and financial institutions with respect to online child sexual exploitation. We've done so through a number of different fronts. First of all, a key part of the issue is raising awareness with financial institutions and other stakeholders. We've issued advisories and alerts around human smuggling and around human trafficking. And in fact, in 2021, we issued a notice on child sexual exploitation and child sexual abusive materials as well. As a result of those notices and advisories, we've had a significant uptick in the number of suspicious activity reports that have been filed by financial institutions, which provides a significant baseline for law enforcement to be able to identify, investigate, and prosecute this type of activity, and will continue to do so.
All right, thank you. And as a representative from Texas, I represent the great state of Texas, I might say that things are not good at the border, and they're not under control. And have you been to the border in the last year?
I have not been to the border, sir.
I've seen firsthand the crisis happening at our southern border. And with these millions of migrants flooding across our borders, human trafficking has become a growing issue, as you know. And this increase in human trafficking has led to an increase in the online hosting of child sexual abuse material. A major concern right now is that the age verification and consent controls implemented by online platforms are being bypassed. So again, Mr. Doss, how is FinCEN working to develop an effective standard for age and consent verification?
So thank you for that question. Again, we work with financial institutions with respect to suspicious activity reporting. And so where financial institutions identify they have reason to know of suspected violations of law or regulation, we receive those reports. We work with law enforcement to review those reports and then to support law enforcement in their efforts to investigate and prosecute these crimes. Again, we are working to review those reports as well as to raise awareness with respect to those issues. In terms of the southwest border as well, we in 2023, just a few months ago, issued a human smuggling, human trafficking alert with respect to the southwest border specifically because of the concerns with respect to human smuggling and human trafficking in that area. And we continue to focus on that region in terms of the concerns there.
Okay. Last month, the Treasury Inspector General appeared before the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, and in his testimony, the Inspector General highlighted a robust plan to release 4 major reports throughout the year regarding FinCEN's management of the Bank Secrecy Act database. I want to highlight that Treasury OIG has over 30 findings and recommendations for FinCEN management as a result of these audits. That is an astounding number, a large number of recommendations considering the size of FinCEN, in combination with the scope of the audit. So one part of the audit that alarms me is the number of external users that have access to the FinCEN database. Your office has 470 MOUs with local, state, and federal law enforcement and intelligence components. This means thousands of people have access to financial transactions other than sensitive BSA data that sometimes FinCEN itself may not even know about. So quickly, how do you plan to address the numerous recommendations made by the OIG, and when will that work begin?
Thank you for that question. It's already begun. We, again, take the protection of BSA data and the management of BSA data incredibly seriously. Again, as I've mentioned, we have a constructive relationship with the Office of Inspector General. We've received their findings and recommendations and are reviewing their concerns. We've already started action to implement a number of their recommendations with respect to various dimensions of the report, even though we haven't gotten the reports yet, and we'll continue to press forward on an expedited basis to implement the recommendations.
Thank you very much, and I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nichols, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer and Vice Ranking Member Pedersen, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. My first question is regarding the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN's exchange program. And I just have to say, I've only been here for 4 months, and maybe this is an area of bipartisan agreement, but the use of acronyms in Washington is just off the charts. Maybe at some point I will just give in and keep using the acronyms all the time, but I'm still at the stage now where it's a lot to talk in a language that my constituents just don't understand. But at least I have, at one time when I will say FinCEN over and over, said Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Acting Director Doss, my first question is to you. This past February, the Federal Trade Commission released data demonstrating that American consumers reported losing $8.8 billion to fraud last year. That's an annual increase of over 30%. Unfortunately, North Carolina ranks 12th among states in fraud reports, costing my constituents and other North Carolinians almost $150 million in losses. Fraudsters and scammers often employ the same techniques and technologies to abuse financial and government systems alike, with the ultimate goal of stealing money. So, FinCEN's exchange program, which facilitates public-private sector collaboration and information sharing to combat financial crime, is critical. Can you speak to whether the FinCEN exchange program's resources have kept pace with the increase in financial fraud and scams we're experiencing? And if not, what more can Congress do to support FinCEN's exchange program?
So thank you for that question. We are very focused on concerns around fraud, around cyber events associated with fraud and business email compromise, and we're very focused on ensuring that we develop the information, review suspicious activity reports, and work with law enforcement to be able to combat fraud in many different dimensions. We recently issued something called a financial trends analysis, which with respect to business email compromise associated with business intrusions and fraud associated with that. We've also issued issued a notice or an advisory around mail theft-enabled fraud, check fraud, which is another serious issue, just to be able to highlight for financial institutions some of the typologies and red flags associated with these types of fraud. So this is an issue that we're incredibly focused on. With respect to responding to fraud as well, we have something called a rapid response program, which helps us work with law enforcement here in the United States and our foreign counterparts to be able to track and then freeze funds associated with fraud that occurs here in the United States, cyber-enabled fraud that occurs here in the United States. And that program has had an incredible amount of success in terms of freezing funds associated with cyber-enabled fraud. In the past year, we've frozen $174 million associated with cyber-enabled fraud. With respect to FinCEN exchanges, this is an incredibly useful tool for us to be able to bring together law enforcement and financial institutions to discuss a range of different types of predicate crimes and illicit activity. We focused on issues around Russia sanctions evasion and a number of other dimensions as well. This year we conducted so far 8 FinCEN exchanges, and we have more on the horizon as well, and we'll be open to considering FinCEN exchanges around fraud.
And what more can we do briefly?
Again, from our perspective, it is incredibly important, again, against the backdrop of the resource constraints that we have, to be able to ensure that we have the teams to be able to work with law enforcement and financial institution to continue to consider the types of reporting that we receive and then to engage proactively with financial institutions.
Thank you. Switching gears a little here, I wanted to share my gratitude and appreciation to sanctions officials at the Treasury Department's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence for their hard work and dedication. Over the years, demands on the department have risen dramatically, given U.S. sanctions on Russia in response to Putin's unprovoked attack on Ukraine. Undersecretary Nelson, given the increase in U.S. sanctions, is the current budget for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence sufficient? Do you have the resources you need?
Given obviously the work, as you noted, to support Ukraine and continue with the strategic aim of limiting the resources Russia has to continue to prosecute this war, as well as to diminish its warfighting capacity by going after its critical material. We are surging, obviously, not only in OFAC, but across TFI. So we have, in our requested budget for the coming fiscal year, asked for additional resources to meet those needs.
Gentleman yields back. That would go to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today. Mr. Doss, I'd like to thank you for Treasury's swift response to the letter that Chairman Lukemeyer and I sent to you about Section 6204 and 6205 of the AML Act of 2020, which I would like to insert for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
One thing I've noticed since I've been in Congress is agencies tend to respond a lot quicker around appropriations season. And so I do, not saying that that was the intention there, but I did notice in the letter that the lack of funding was highlighted as one of the reasons that we haven't received the reports that were required by Section 6204 and 6205. Now, those were supposed to be to Congress within a year of January 1st, 2021, and we still have not received those reports. Now, the reason we ask for information, and my concern is, I'm not sure, based on what was in the letter and some comments that you have made recently, that you're really taking congressional oversight very seriously. The reason that we want this is for legislative purposes. Now, you may not agree with the legislative purpose we have, but that is our role, and by law, that is what you are supposed to respond to. So my first question, when specifically did FinCEN begin working to carry out the requirements of 6204 and 6205?
So thank you for that. Again, it's incredibly important for us to think through how to improve and enhance and make the AML-CFT framework more effective. We've been working on the suite of reports in the AML Act around enhancing and improving and modernizing the AML-CFT framework since I've been on the job.
When did that begin?
That was in September of 2021. And we've been working incredibly hard across the full range of dimensions with respect to enhancing the AML-CFT framework. We issued an RFI, a request for information, With respect to the Section 6216 report, that's the report to modernize, streamline, and update the AML-CFT regulations in December of 2021. The comment period closed. We received 140 comments, and we've been reviewing those comments and consulting with over 24 agencies. In terms of identifying and developing recommendations with respect to Section 6216, a number of the comments that we received in the context of that request for information also applied to some of the issues covered by the 6204 and 6205 reports, which relate to SAR and CTR thresholds and automation around SARs and CTRs. And we've been actively considering the various comments that have been made, and we've been thinking through how to best address those comments, the recommendations made in those comments, and then to think through how to best work with our counterpart agencies in terms of finalizing
Well, I need
those
to reclaim my
recommendations.
time because I've got some other questions, and I'm not sure I really got the answer that we're looking for in there, because I'm still looking for the reports that are supposed to come to Congress, and now we're over a year beyond that time frame. So, and understand resources are an obstacle. But let me also bring up, in 2022, FinCEN received over 4.3 million SARs across all industries. That's a 43% increase from 2021. Now, if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, that haystack is growing. And I don't see how you store that much data securely, let alone analyze this amount of data. And in this committee's conversations with former FinCEN leadership, they agree the data is overwhelming, and they called into question whether BSA reporting framework is useful at all. Given the fact that the DOJ has failed to provide information on the usefulness of BSA data, do you think that FinCEN would be more effective and less strained for resources if the monetary thresholds for CTRs and SARs were raised?
So thank you for that question. Again, law enforcement and our national security partners have consistently reaffirmed the value of SARs, as well as the other information that we receive. Again, as part of our efforts to develop the reports under 6204 and 6205, one of the key issues that we're considering is how and whether to raise the thresholds across a number of dimensions, as well as considering whether or not to automate the filing.
So
Again,
that is something that you're looking at.
that
That's
is something
something
that-
we're
that-
looking at
that is
as
something that
well.
we're looking at.
And so that's why these reports are so critical, because I am moving forward with legislation to increase those. To give you an example, when the CTRs were done, there in 1970s, it was a $10,000 threshold. If we were to adjust those for inflation today, it would be over $80,000. We want to be able to make your job more effective, to get to the bad guys and filter through less of, basically make the haystack smaller. It's more effective that way. As from an intelligence background, in the military and security background, you're more effective when you have less noise in what you're looking for. So again, I'm out of time, and I want to respect the chairman's request that we stay in, and so I'll submit the rest of the questions for the record. But Mr. Doss, we expect to have those reports sooner rather than later.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you convening this very important hearing, and the Vice Ranking Member, too. Thank you very much for being here. Today, the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned 4 senior officials of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence organization. I appreciate that the Treasury Department has increased the pace of sanctions designations targeting Iran over the past year. However, the pace of designations is woefully, I believe, inadequate given the scope of Iran's violations. Undersecretary Nelson, what are you doing to increase the effectiveness of our Iran sanctions?
So I just want to affirm that we are profoundly concerned about Iran and a range of activities, the abuse of its people, destabilizing activities in the region, obviously the development of its nuclear program and what we perceive to be a growing role in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So, as you noted, we have dramatically increased the pace of designations in all of those categories. I can just give you a flavor of what we're focused on. So we've designated a number of individuals involved in aiding the regime's crackdown on peaceful protests and demonstrators, including 11 just last month, 4 earlier this week, and 73 since last year. We've issued a general license to expand the availability of U.S. Communications-related services and software to be available to Iranians, given the regime's crackdown on communications tech, and that's something that I've been following very closely. And then we've continued to sanction people and companies that support Russia's unjust war, and just last week we sanctioned procurement networks supporting Iran's UAV drone program, which is a significant area of concern for us. We previously designated 19 individuals and 9 entities involved in that program. We are also taking action against Iran, trade in petroleum and petrochemicals. Obviously, that's a huge source of revenue for them.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about that, if I may interrupt you. And again, thank you for that answer. I think that Iran is one of the most dangerous countries in the world, and especially obviously as they're racing towards a nuclear weapon. Do you know how much oil Iran is currently exporting and how much revenue it's generating from these exports? And how do these figures compare to 3 years ago?
I don't have that in front of me, but obviously
Could you give me a sense of how much?
I don't have a sense for you, although I, can say just a couple of weeks ago we designated a 36 or so entities that were part of a network of facilitating the sale of petrochemicals, and we believe that network is worth billions of dollars.
Well, I'm very concerned about that because I don't think that our efforts have been very successful in doing this, just to be honest with you. So I hope that we continue to push on this. Now, I did want to ask a little bit about fentanyl. Obviously, it's a problem that we've all had. You said personally today, I believe, that you've been down to the border. When you were there, did you speak to anybody to ask, where does most of the fentanyl come through the border? Does it come through the land port of entries or in between the land port of entries?
I believe I recall it was all of the above was a form of the answer.
No, it's not.
No. Okay.
No, it's not. Over 90% of the fentanyl comes through the actual land port of entry, not in between. In fact, I'm always interested when people start talking about all these millions of people that are crossing without documents. Very little fentanyl comes through there. It mostly comes through the actual port of entry. And in fact, it usually comes through trucks that are examined, but not very thoroughly, and also through vehicles. I've been there many, many times. I live in San Diego. I live on the border. I've represented the actual California-Mexico border for 30 years, do ride-alongs and do all these things. And it's very interesting how some of the sophisticated technology that we have now captures it. But I'm always interested in understanding that when you talk to the Border Patrol, when you talk to CBP, they'll tell you, most of it comes right through there. In fact, it's going down now, but during this whole time of COVID-19, over 75% of the people who actually get caught sneaking this fentanyl, this terrible drug that's killing our people, are American citizens.
I had the opportunity to visit one of the stations that scans the trucks and made the point about sort of the networks of drivers to move the fentanyl through these, that's your point, very large vehicles.
My time's up, and I thank the chair very much. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, one of the new members of our committee.
Thank you,
5
Chairman.
minutes.
I thank the ranking member as well. First question, regarding sanctions on the fentanyl issue, funding coming out of China, payments being made into Mexico, which, by the way, has turned into many parts into a gangland, not due to ports of entry, but due to the horrific situation at the border. And 75%, we talk about 100,000 deaths, 80,000 or so from fentanyl, and yet we're trying to make excuses or not do anything about it. So maybe you guys are doing something about it by cutting off some of that funding. Have you found any? Have you found any funding? Have we sanctioned? Have we put people in jail?
So we have focused, if you're talking about Chinese money
Talking about-
laundering
yes,
organizations.
Precisely. To the drug dealers, the very wealthy drug dealers that have been created throughout Mexico.
Yeah, we have done a risk assessment on this, and we have found that these professional money laundering organizations are being used to finance and using our, frankly, infrastructure.
My only
financial
question is,
infrastructure.
have you caught any?
We have, yes. We've designated CMLOs in the past, and we can send that over to
Okay,
you.
so we're catching them. Okay, that's what where I wanted to go. Thank you. So, Acting Director Das, on changing subjects, Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act in 2021 to increase information sharing between financial institutions and the federal government. CTA goes into effect next year. It will require most companies to report information known as beneficial ownership, which you're well familiar with. My understanding is that FinCEN's proposed rule does not allow banks to use this information beyond the opening of an account. Do you think that financial institutions should be able to use this beneficial ownership information in the registry for purposes other than onboarding a customer?
So thank you for that question. Again, our proposed rule proposes a specific scope for the access that financial institutions have to beneficial ownership information, as well as the purposes for which they can use beneficial ownership information. There were a number of comments on this point.
Yes, there were.
And so we've been reviewing those comments intensively and considering how best to approach the final rule on this point. And so we're working on that. And again, we are still in the policy process with respect to an outcome on that.
Good, because it seems to make a lot of sense to be able to use the information for other important purposes, and that's the criticism that you've been receiving, but it's very good to hear that this is going to be very carefully reviewed, and you'll take industry input and come up with what you think is best. All right, that's very encouraging to hear. You skipped me right to the bottom. I don't need to ask any more questions on it then. That's good. So I do want to ask you about this. Within the customer information program, it's designed to ensure customer certainty without burdensome regulations for the fintechs. Now, it's come to me that getting the full Social Security number on fintechs, where credit cards mostly need the four digits, is a concern for those type of lenders. Is there a good reason that that's the case, or is that something that you're considering looking at making it more efficient for these lenders?
So thank you for that question. That's an issue that's come to us. We're taking a look at it. We have an application pending as to whether or not to permit that. And again, that's something that we're considering internally and working through and looking at it fairly across all of the different dimensions for the purposes of ensuring that we can confirm identity, ensuring that we implement a risk-based approach towards our regulatory framework, but also to ensure that we are able to ensure that financial institutions know who the actors are behind the accounts as well. So that's a question that we're taking a serious look at.
That's very good to hear as well. I look forward to following you up on that. Lastly, I'm just going to go back to the China trade related to fentanyl. If you have an initiative, first of all, first question is that a core mission for FinCEN? Finding out who's delivering and the type of funding that's taken place, the illicit financing of this huge illicit drug industry that's taken place. But secondly, if you provided a request for funding for that purpose, my guess is you will have strong bipartisan support to catch this awful cartel, right? So you could. I've run out of time, so I yield back.
You want to answer that very quickly, Director?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a dedicated team focused on the issue of fentanyl. We're using all of our tools and authorities to be able to better understand the financial flows associated with fentanyl in our work that we're doing with the DEA as well. So this is an issue that we're engaging. We're using our authorities on to collect information, and then we're trying to better understand the money laundering networks associated with opioid trafficking on this front and engaging with law enforcement.
Thank you, Chairman.
Very good. Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to Mr. Nunn, distinguished gentleman from Iowa. for 5 minutes.
Very grateful, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for being here today. You know, as we look at what the financial services and actually the Ag Committee is doing in the digital asset space, there are just a few of us who are serving in this crossover role between commodities and securities. You know, one of the things that we have found in both, and I was just coming between each committee right now, is that there seems to be a lack of a regulatory environment or structure that really provides the rules of the road, and there's a lot of talk about people jumping in and framing it without necessarily talking to each other, which is where I applaud the chairs of both the Financial Services and the Ag Committee for working well on this in the House. I also want to note, you know, as a military member myself and someone who spent over a decade in counterintelligence working in illicit financing, I want to thank the Treasury for being such a strong leader in this. And that's why this morning we introduced the bipartisan, bicameral Financial Technology Protection Act of 2023 with my colleague, Representative Himes, Senator Budd, and Senator Gillibrand. Specifically, what this legislation would aim to do is look at independent financial technology working group to include terrorism and illicit financing. Treasury was very helpful in providing some feedback to that and helping us shape it. Specifically in this working group, Mr. Nelson, I want to highlight that this includes our senior levels from the DOJ, FBI, CIA, FinCEN as a partner in this, just to name a few. As we look forward on this, Mr. Doss, I'd like to begin with you. This working group's intent is to conduct independent research on terrorists, how their illicit financing works, how they fund things going forward. It would be a window into how this is operating, particularly now that we're looking at digital assets as being a key mode for these individuals to finance themselves, everything from the IRGC to cartels south of the border. You know, one of the things that you had brought up here was your wealth of knowledge related to the illicit finance and use of digital assets. In your view, is this something that Treasury, along with other senior representatives from both the government and our private sector partners, should further explore to combat and really get their arms around the scope of illicit financing?
So thank you for that. At FinCEN, we currently have a number of engagements where we have public-private opportunities to exchange information. We have a program called the Innovation Hours program where we meet with private sector stakeholders, and we use our FinCEN exchanges to exchange information with private sector stakeholders and law enforcement around issues involving digital assets and payment modernization, and to be able to understand the illicit finance risks. Again, these are ongoing conversations. We plan on continuing these conversations as we think through the risks and the impacts on our regulatory framework.
Has it been helpful?
Those conversations have been incredibly helpful for us to be able to understand the lay of the land with respect to where innovation is going and what the illicit finance risks are associated with that. They've also been incredibly helpful to us for law enforcement and us to be able to communicate some of those illicit finance risks to those innovators and entrepreneurs that are developing new systems. Again, for us, what we see over and over again is that technology is incredibly important to be able to provide financial services to customers across the board, but often it's important for those technology innovations to ensure that compliance is built in and that they understand what the compliance framework is.
So, Mr. Doss, appreciate that. I think the feedback, particularly from the private sector and where the innovation is going, is key. Let me get to the second part of this. In 2020, I believe you put out a request for feedback, or FinCEN did. I've not seen any of that feedback reported out. So my question here is, when you get feedback from market participants, particularly on the private side, and then any proposed rule change, what were the primary concerns with any proposal going forward, and do we have a timeline in which we here in Congress are going to get to see that?
So thank you. I think you're referring to a couple of proposals that were made in late 2020 with respect to digital assets. Those proposed rulemakings had a number of comments. I think one of them had about 8,000 comments. The other had 2,000 comments. We've been reviewing those. Those raised some very complicated policy issues for us.
3 years on, are we going to get to see that report?
We're still working through a final rulemaking with respect to all of those comments.
Okay, we would like to see that sooner rather than later. If there's not a need for one, then let's move forward. Very quickly, Mr. Secretary, appreciate it. I want to follow up on what the chair asked. I know we don't advertise what our sanctions regimes are, but we also know the danger of not having a sanctions regime that is effective and timely. Sanctioning Russian oligarchs' yachts clearly has not slowed down the war in Ukraine. My concern here is there a plan in place for a situation with the Taiwanese Strait specifically?
Again, I'll just.
If you're not going to comment, that's fine, but I do want to highlight the intractable and secondary effects of a sanctions regime against a nation like China. If it is not thought out ahead of time, will have massive ramification. Are you considering that?
So one of the things that we've done, and just briefly, happy to send more information, is just stood up an office of sanctions economists in order to really go after sort of the effect of our sanctions, mitigations, and then sort of do an after action every time we do a sanction so that we can be more effective.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. De La Cruz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important meeting this afternoon, and thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to appear before the committee today. Several times in listening to the questions from my colleagues, I've heard that you all are working on the report. You haven't had the resources yet, and there's been a delay, some up from 1 year to up to 3 years, as my colleague Mr. Nunn indicated. My question is for Acting Director Doss. Do you still have any employees working remotely?
Yes, ma'am, we do.
Why are federal employees working in national security roles working remotely?
So we have a range of employees across our 300-person workforce. Many of them come into work on a regular basis in a classified environment to work in SCIFs, and they come in regularly. They review the information in a classified setting, and they process that information in a classified setting. We are incredibly mindful of the security considerations around the use of our data, whether it be BSA data or classified information. We have other functions, for example, management functions, that don't require employees to come in on a regular basis. And a telework environment is a suitable environment for them because they're not handling classified information or BSA information.
So how are you assuring that your remote workers are not handling any classified or sensitive information?
So no remote workers are handling classified information outside of the workplace.
Will you be bringing any of these remote workers back to the workforce or bringing them back to the office full time?
So so we're currently considering the OMB guidance that was recently issued with respect to telework, and thinking through what our policy will be going forward. We will be considering the best way forward on this front, given all of the needs.
You said what guidance?
OMB guidance.
OMB. And what is OMB?
OMB is the Office of Management and Budget out of the White House, and they've recently issued guidance with respect to consideration by agencies of their telework policies in light of the end of the pandemic, and that's guidance that we're considering and working very closely with our counterparts at the Treasury Department to think through how to best implement it.
So the remote workers are still as per the pandemic, is that correct?
Well, we have been changing our policy over time to meet health needs and security needs. But again, we are incredibly mindful of the security and confidentiality of our information and doing so.
And you would say health needs as in the COVID?
As in COVID, yes.
Okay. Now, Under Secretary Nelson, earlier this year, I introduced H.R. 1076, the Preventing the Financing of Illegal Synthetic Drugs Act. This bill, approved by this committee, requires the Government Accountability Office to carry out a study on how the illicit finance supports drug traffickers peddling fentanyl and synthetic drugs. I'm grateful to Chairman Luke DeMeyer for his leadership in this subcommittee and looking forward to my measure coming before the House floor in Congress. Under Secretary Nelson, what steps has your office taken to prevent the financing of illegal drugs and what it has caused by our communities? And why, I guess more importantly, is why does your office repeatedly cite the International Emergency Economic Powers Act instead of a more targeted authorities granted by Congress like the Fentanyl Sanctions Act? And that's really my true question.
Thank you for that question. We just generally, we use all of the authorities, obviously, that we have under IEPA. There's an executive order that's President Biden issued at the end of 2021 that provided additional authorities to go after the supply chains undergirding the fentanyl, but all drug trafficking. So that is an authority that we have used frequently over the course of the last year. It is an authority that has allowed us to sanction and really escalate our narcotic sanctions across the global supply chain, which has been a strategic focus of ours because that's where we feel like we can have the most impact to really get after these drug trafficking organizations and transnational criminal organizations that are facilitating, obviously, the flow of this horrible drug.
Thank you so much. And one last comment really to Director Doss. With COVID already being lifted and the rest of the world, especially private sector, working, I think it's time to bring people back to the office.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam. You know, I think one of the concerns I have for really both agencies, you know, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the, you know, Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Department, is priorities. And so, you know, and it's not a hostile line of questioning. It's just more of, you know, information gathering. But when I look back since 2001, FinCEN's collected over 350 million currency transactions, right? And in the backdrop of increased activity from Russia, the Mexican cartels, Chinese corporations, not just the CCP, but the Chinese corporations, what are you doing specifically? Because again, when I look at this, you know, it's 350 million records. That's primarily innocent Americans versus these actors that we know are leveraging the U.S. economy to finance their own military operations. They're using our economy to undermine our country, our own economy. And Mr. Doss, what are you doing specifically to divert your attention away from innocent Americans and over to the CCP, to Russia, to the cartels?
So thank you for that. We're very focused on current illicit finance threats, particularly Russia. We have done quite a bit of work since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of issuing advisories and alerts on Russia's sanctions evasion, on efforts by Russian oligarchs and elites and proxies to evade sanctions and hide their assets here in the United States and elsewhere. We've issued an advisory with respect to export control evasion jointly with the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security. We've issued one with respect to how Russian oligarchs and actors are using the commercial real estate sector to hide assets as well. We've been reviewing the information and suspicious activity reports, and there's been a significant uptick in terms of SARS related to that, and working with our counterparts at OFAC, at Main Treasury, and in law enforcement to be able to evaluate the types of information that we're getting across those ranges of suspicious activity reports, and then working with them to identify the networks and then help them investigate and prosecute with respect to all of that. So again, that's a number one priority for us, and we're taking a look at current information to address those concerns. Ransomware is another significant priority of ours, and we're working very closely with the Department of Justice and other agencies in better understanding ransomware actors, the types of technology and strains that they use to commit ransomware attacks, and then how they're using money laundering tools and cryptocurrency exchanges to hide their assets as well, to track and trace those assets and then to go after those assets. We recently designated under one of our tools called Section 9714 of the NDAA that allows us to identify foreign financial institutions that are a primary money laundering concern in connection with Russian illicit finance. And we recently designated an entity called Bitslato, which is a Hong Kong-based cryptocurrency exchange that's linked to Russian illicit finance, Russian ransomware, and darknet markets as well, to be able to prevent that entity from interacting with the U.S. financial system as well. Again, as I've mentioned before, we're working on fentanyl and very active on that front. So again, across the range of activities, we are very focused on recent threats in collaboration with Undersecretary Nelson and under his leadership, as well as with law enforcement, OFAC, and other agencies.
Well, what about, kind of switching to China, Mr. Nelson? The Treasury prohibits, buying securities linked to the Chinese military-industrial complex, but a lot of the corporations that are privately held, secondary investment or market, are participating in the U.S. economy, again, funding China's military complex. So it's an end around our own regulations. What are we going to do as we go forward to target these corporations that are worth billions of dollars that are, again, players in our own economy and at funding our enemy?
So a couple of things.
And you've got about 30 seconds before we're out of time.
This is a very important question. I want to answer this one. We're going to take whatever amount of time it takes.
Close the gap. And I think we've identified and have been working on a couple of really important areas in this respect. The first is obviously the work that we're doing to implement the Corporate Transparency Act, so we see the beneficial owners behind domestic and foreign corporations. The second thing that we are looking at very closely is investment advisors, because we are looking at the risk associated with investment advisors and not being able to see behind the true revenue source behind the investment advisor, and that could come from Russia, China, and a bunch of other places. And the third sector that we perceive there to be a risk is real estate. So looking again there. So we're trying to close, to your point, we're trying to close that, what we perceive to be gaps within our own system, so that these bad actors can't do all the things that I think you accurately described, take advantage of our people, of our American businesses for their own illicit, frankly, gains.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, I'll just close with this comment. When we look at the what's happened with some of the banking system in the United States, if I'm a bad actor, and when I say bad actor, I mean a foreign country, the next attack is probably economic. And so the 350 million records, it's not that grandmother on a fixed income that you're tracking her transactions. We've got to start doing a better job of attacking, targeting, and limiting China and Russia in our economy. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Kim. She's recognized for
Thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. Recently, the North Korea People's Assembly adopted a new law in September 2022 that allows Kim Jong-un regime to strike first with nuclear weapons if the regime feels threatened. So in other words, that means that law will give Kim Jong-un regime the unprecedented authorities to utilize nuclear weapons for any reason. In 2022, the regime hit a record number of missile tests, as we know. And the Kim Jong-un regime, each time they do the test, they improve its ability to strike the continental United States with an ICBM. So it's concerning. And a recent investigation by the Financial Times exposed how the Kim Jong-un regime utilizes its criminal networks to smuggle oil into North Korea and get access to foreign currency to finance their nuclear weapons program. The investigation tracked a foreign vessel, the Unica, that made 23 journeys into North Korea to deliver oil and petroleum products. So Undersecretary Nelson, can you tell us what the Treasury is doing to stop vessels like Unica and cut North Korea off from getting their ability to get hard currency and oil coming from other countries, specifically from Russia and China?
Thank you for that important question. So obviously, North Korea's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile program is a top priority not only of the Treasury Department but across our government for all of the reasons that you've expressed. Using our tools, we have focused on trying to identify the procurement networks that are directly tied to the WMD program, and we've I think done almost 24 sanctions related to companies and entities that are supporting supplying the actual material that North Korea needs to build its missiles and its weapons of mass destruction. The second thing that we have been focused on is, to your point, going after the revenue generators. So Those come in a couple of different flavors. One, we have the IT workers that generate a substantial amount of revenue for the regime. So I think working with FinCEN, we've worked to identify trends and typologies for financial institutions and companies so they can identify that.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that you see more urgency from the Treasury Department to make North Korea sanctions more effective. But now I want to switch gear to another topic. The Corporate Transparency Act directs the FinCEN to collect information in a form and manner that ensures information is highly useful. But the information in the registry will not be highly useful unless it is validated by the FinCEN. But to my knowledge, the agency has not publicly stated that it intends to validate the information reported. So without that validation, bad actors may report false or inaccurate information to the registry. So does FinCEN intend to validate that information reported to the registry? If so, what validation solutions is FinCEN considering?
So thank you for that question. Again, in the response to the comments to the Access NPRM, we heard loud and clear the importance of validation, and we agree with the importance of validation. Again, this is an issue that is front and center for us in terms of thinking through how to achieve this. And it presents a range of considerations for us that are pragmatic considerations. There are legal considerations, cost considerations, and then a number of questions with respect to how to implement validation as well.
Do you need support from Congress? If so, what type of support do you need from us? And does FinCEN need to ensure the agency can validate the information reported to the registry? Can you be specific? What help do you need?
Absolutely. So we are working through a number of considerations regarding constraints that there may be with respect to legal constraints. Our ability to access other databases as well, whether they be public databases or commercial databases, that will allow us to validate this information in an effective and fluid way. And that's one of the things that we're considering right now as we talk to stakeholders is what are the range of available databases and what is the quality of the databases in our ability to validate that information. And so these are issues that are front and center for us along with the cost considerations of validation and verification. And so as we walk through all of these considerations, pragmatic, legal, cost, and other related considerations, we stand ready to work with you, and we'll come back to you on that.
Thank you. I will yield, even though I had another question to ask.
Gentlelady yields back with that. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davison, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance.
I thank the chairman, and I think our representatives from Treasury and FinCEN as a component of Treasury. Thanks for the work you do, and for the people that aren't here that you represent and serve. Thank them from us as well. Earlier this week, FinCEN announced the renewal and expansion of its geographic targeting orders, otherwise known as GTOs. This is the 14th time FinCEN has issued a real estate GTO because these orders expire after 6 months. GTOs themselves are rarely noteworthy, but as the chair of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, I believe it's important to highlight how these targeting orders have changed over time. GTOs began as all cash purchases over $1 million in cities like Miami and New York, but now cover purchases of 300,000 plus residences in 10 cities and 42 counties in 13 states, including and Washington, D.C. The exception to this is an astonishing low threshold of $50,000 in the city and county of Baltimore. FinCEN has a difficult mission, and we understand that. However, I would like to reiterate that these geographic targeting orders should be more targeted. I mean, they're essentially warrantless spying on American citizens most of the time. So I fear that FinCEN is hoping to chip away with every renewal until it eventually collects data on every cash purchase of every piece of real estate in every city across the country. And that's why I requested that my draft legislation be attached to the hearing today, the, quote, Civil Liberties Protection Act of 2023. It would create a position of Civil Liberties Officer within FinCEN to monitor and potentially reel in these overly broad actions by FinCEN which can undermine housing purchases and, frankly, engage in warrantless buying of American assets, especially those carried out with digital assets. Acting Director Das, with regard to GTOs, at what point do you believe they cross the line and infringe on Americans' right to privacy?
So thank you for that. Again, from our perspective, we take privacy considerations very seriously in the work that we do. We work very closely with our legal counsel in terms of ensuring that our GTOs, our geographic targeting orders, are appropriately scoped and they are within the confines of the law. With respect to the GTOs and the real estate GTOs, we hear consistently from law enforcement that they are incredibly valuable in their ability to be able to understand how criminals use real estate to be able to launder money and the proceeds of crime, including drug trafficking, corruption, and
How
other
do you
types
actually
of
measure
crimes.
that? So, I mean, you get these reports, and I've asked for, in the most classified settings possible. I'm happy to travel, happy to have you all. We have a SCIF that's supposed to be secure here. And, we're saying, give us some metrics. Show me a case where something that you collected using these GTOs solved a crime. You pick your issue with, the beneficial ownership rule. We're supporting, frankly, infringing civil liberties of American citizens, but give us the evidence. People ask for the support, they want the law, they want to make it legal to, frankly, infringe on the 14th Amendment, or the Fourth Amendment, I mean. How do you measure the effectiveness?
So on a number of different fronts, we, as we prepare a new round of GTOs, we consult very closely with law enforcement in terms
I know they have a desire, but can you share with us a case? I'm happy to schedule a meeting to look at it in a SCIF or anything, but show me a case where what you collected resulted in a solved crime.
40% of the GTOs, the reports that we receive with respect to GTOs on real estate are correlate to suspicious activities that we receive through reporting from financial institutions. So again, there is a strong correlation between the reporting that we receive.
I understand, thanks. And look, it's all correlated. I'm looking for cause and effect. I mean, if you want to keep spying on American citizens, you're going to have to show why. Undersecretary Nelson, I'd like to briefly touch on OFAC and the ongoing coordination with our allies to uniformly impose these sanctions. Whenever an entity or individual is sanctioned, does OFAC take steps to ensure that our allies are also utilizing their sanctioning authority? And what does that look like? I mean, I'm particularly concerned about NATO countries like Bulgaria that aren't supporting our sanctions.
No, thank you for that. Yes, actually, we work very closely with our EU, UK, and the 30 other partners and allies every time we designate someone in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have different legal standards. Obviously, we have different authorities, but we have consistent since the time of Russia's invasion, now 15 months later, worked with our partners and allies and have coordinated around targets, sectors, individuals, and have continued to try to align our designations as closely as we reasonably can, given that we have different legal authorities. But that
thanks for your
cooperation has
follow-up,
been very
and my
strong.
time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. With that, we have finished up our round of questioning. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. Got one quick comment, though, and this is for Mr. Director Doss here. A couple times you've talked about your budget and wanting to have more money for this. We understand there's always more demands. But as you can see with the questioning we had here today, when you don't have people back at work and you have so many millions of SARs and CRTs that are never utilized, they're never examined. There's a waste of people's time and energy there. If I was going to approve your budget, I would ask you to give me an outline of how you're going to save money. How are you going to start putting your people to work to maximize their ability to get the job done, cut back on all the SARs that don't infringe, as the gentleman just said, on people's civil liberties, as well as enable you to do your job. At some point, there's got to be a point here that this can meet, but we're not there. And if you're going to come to us for a budget request, If I'm in this chair to make that decision, you don't get a penny until you can show me how you can save some money. Because I don't think that we need to allow this kind of activity to go on without some accountability. With that, though, without objection, I'd like to enter into the following document into the record. It's the American FinTech Council letter to FinCEN regarding the Customer Information Program rules. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written requests, questions for their witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for the response. Ask our witnesses to please respond to them as promptly as possible. And with that, hearing is adjourned.